G'day you mob, how's it going? Welcome to this episode of Aussie English. Today I have an interview episode for your listening pleasure, and I have the absolute honour of chatting with Simon Roper, who is from the UK. You will hear that in his accent. I believe he has a southern UK accent, and he is an archaeology student in Britain, or at least he was at the time that I found his content on YouTube and started binge watching it to learn all about things like Old English and how English has changed. So he has an absolutely fascinating YouTube channel, which you can find if you do a search for Simon Roper. So he's an archaeologist, but he's also interested in linguistics and paleontology and evolution, everything like that. So anyway, I thought I would invite him onto the podcast to have a big long chat about the history of English, how it's changed from Old English to Middle English to Modern English, why those changes occurred, what it was probably like for the different cultures as they were mixing, and the different words and things that came into English and from where they came. So we sat down and ended up talking for almost 2 hours. So I'm going to split this episode into two. I hope you enjoy it. And without any further ado, I give you Simon Roper. How are you going anyway, dude? How's your day been?
Yeah, not too bad. It's weird seeing you, sort of interacting with you, you know, like...
Why is that? Like, did you check out some of the videos, did you?
Yeah, no, I did. Yeah. No, it's good. It's weird. I don't know.
It's the same for me because I was just watching. I've been binge watching your videos probably for the last 2 hours or so, trying to get up to speed on a bunch of these different things worth asking you and chatting to you about. Because
thank you.
It's definitely not my background, I guess. So we've already started the podcast, man. I like doing it in sort of a very relaxed sort of way. But Simon Roper, welcome to the podcast. You are, or at least you were, a student of archaeology in England, and you also have a sort of personal interest in anthropology and linguistics. But I'm not sure. I have a feeling when I read that description of you that it may have been written when you first started your YouTube channel quite a while ago. So
I've done the bachelor's degree. I'm doing a master's this next year because it's sort of attached to the bachelor's. There's an integrated master's course, so I've sort of managed to get onto that, which wasn't much effort, to be honest. I just went into the office and said, "Can I be on this?"
Have you seen my YouTube channel? Give me the course.
No, it's not even that. They'll do it for anyone. I think that half sort of is half decent archaeology within the course, I think, but. Yeah, so I'm still actually at uni there for the time being, but I don't know what I'm going to do afterwards. Just
become a YouTuber, start a podcast.
Yeah.
Do you know my background at all?
I don't know your background. No.
Sorry, it wasn't a trick question. So I did my bachelor's, my master's, and my PhD all in evolution. Well, the bachelor's was in biology and zoology and ecology, and then it was the master's and the PhD were in evolutionary biology, so phylogenetics.
That's fantastic.
But I finished the PhD and was just like, I'm done. I want to do podcasting.
Not surprised after a PhD, yeah. But it's not as if like you've been through the toughest sort of corners of academia and you've come out and you've thought, right, fuck that.
It just feels like slave labor looking back on it, because here in Australia, at least, I don't know what it's like in Britain, but in Australia you get, if you have to effectively get a scholarship in order to get the PhD, unless you can prove that you can self-fund it. So unless you were to show up and say, here's $100,000 that I have in my bank, I can afford to support myself for the next 4 years, but I don't have a scholarship. They're going to say, where's your scholarship? Okay, now we'll talk about giving you the PhD. So, but you get on this measly scholarship of maybe $25,000 a year, at least when I was doing it. And so it's like $400 a week to try and, make ends meet and get enough food and everything. And so, but you're working like full time, right? So it's absolutely crazy. So yeah, definitely once you finish your masters, definitely have a think about, should I cut my losses?
That's
how much of a difference will it make?
I don't know about it. Like, I don't know. Everyone that I've ever known to either be on a PhD course or have a PhD has always just said there were so many, times during the process, like they had to get within the last couple of years of it before they actually started thinking, it's not worth stopping at this point. I've just got to, just got to get it because there's no point.
Well,
But
I think the hardest part today, especially if you want to continue in academia, it's just given that you need it. You have to have that because everyone else has it. And so
yeah,
I remember when my mother, she used to tell me, and my father too, they both went through university at the same university, funnily enough, doing the same sort of stuff, biology. And they went through and did, I think, bachelor's honors and then tried to do PhDs, but both bailed. But the reason they both bailed is they had job opportunities come up where they
yeah.
didn't
Like
need PhDs because no one else
why
really had them.
carry on
So,
doing it? Exactly, yeah,
but nowadays, if you go to and apply for it, everyone's like, okay, I've got my third year postdoc, experience here after the PhD, and I'm
yeah,
also willing to work for peanuts. You're just
yeah.
like, there's just too much competition. So, can you tell me a bit about where you grew up in Britain and how you ended up studying archaeology at university?
It's it's sort of in the south. It's like 40 minutes south of London, sort of thing. Um, it's not a particularly interesting place, really. It's called Guildford. It's just sort of it's a. I think a lot of people would probably describe it as a bit posh, just going by the accents, I think. But it's nice. I mean, my dad's side of the family's from sort of the north of England, which is more interesting
Oh,
dialectally. I mean,
cool.
everywhere's interesting dialect-wise, but I think I'm more interested in the north of England dialect-wise. But I don't really know what triggered the archaeology thing. It came out of an interest in evolutionary biology. Actually, I went through sort of biology at school, got kind of hooked on the evolutionary aspect. So I don't
Respect.
know. I feel like a bit in awe at this point, but I've never actually. I don't think I've ever actually spoken to someone who had a PhD in evolutionary biology, apart from my lecturer at uni, who there was a human evo module which kind of got slightly messed about with because of um, coronavirus, um,
Ah,
but I've never really talked to anyone apart from him who had a PhD in evolutionary biology. But he worked on uh, Rising Star in South Africa, like the Hominoledi stuff that came out a few years ago. The, the little cave with a sort of thin cavity going into it. So he had a lot to say on that. Um, but I don't know. I don't know where the linguistics thing came from. Really, I think it started off just as an interest in sort of regional dialects.
so yeah,
Um,
because you have a background in archaeology, obviously it's human archaeology, and
yeah, yeah.
I guess all archaeology is human, but
Well,
at least for the most part, unless you're studying what cats out of
I
Egypt's
mean, like,
pyramids.
yeah. I mean, livestock are a little thing in it, but it's
Yeah. So, how did you get the interest in anthropology and linguistics? Did that kind of come along with the fascination in archaeology? That you obviously, if you're interested in the study of past cultures, then it kind of comes along with that you're going to be interested in human relationships as well as language, right?
yeah. Like I think in anthropology, there's a lot of stuff that um like there is so the differences between human cultures can be extremely vast in the modern day. So to really understand ancient cultures, I think it's hard to really understand a lot of aspects of them. There are some aspects that are just inaccessible now, I think, but to really understand a lot of aspects of them, you have to understand that people can be very, very different from the way that we are, and people can think very, very differently from the way that we think. So I think it's important when studying ancient cultures to sort of realize what differences can exist between modern cultures. So ethnographic analogy is it's sort of a big thing in archaeology, but people debate its usefulness. So like using modern cultures to kind of projecting the kind of differences we see in modern cultures onto ancient cultures. Because obviously, if you're going into specifics, it can get a bit dodgy. It can get a bit sort of like I think there's some idea about there are people in Madagascar that associate wood with life and stone with death, and you can project that onto Stonehenge if you want, and that's really sort of clutching at straws. But
Yeah,
like it's important. I don't know. I've gone off on a bit of a ramble here.
that's
I
the
didn't
point.
expect to
Go
talk
for
about
it.
archaeology, but yeah. But it's just very. I mean, it's probably the kind of thing you get in paleoanthropology as well. Is it like the sort of applying modern Western intuition where it's not necessarily
Yeah.
that applicable? Like it's trying to interpret, for example, the behavior of early hominins from a very sort of modern point of view, if you see what I mean, and just using intuition to to extrapolate things from that.
I guess that's one of those hardest things, though, in science, right? Because we're all subjective beings where we have our own experiences, and we have to try and become objective and solve problems objectively. But more often than not, it's very difficult to avoid putting your own subjective views and experiences and opinions onto the thing as a base as well, right? Because it's just so hard to start from scratch and be like, I'm going to come in with absolutely nothing on the table.
Yeah, like you can't really, like, I think we're so, the ability to sort of pick up culture is so intrinsic to us that we couldn't operate if we didn't have a cultural lens to see through. Even if those cultural lenses might be very, very different from place to place, we couldn't operate without one. There wouldn't be anthropology without cultural lenses, which is a bit irritating, but it's
So what makes British archaeology so fascinating? Because I mean, there's TV shows about it with is it Baldrick, the guy from Blackadder? You know, they was that Time Team or
Time Team? Yeah,
Time Team going around for years. My folks used to love watching that, along with what's the other one where they go to the antique show? Is it the Royal Antique Show or something where some guy brings a box of stuff from his
or something like that?
Yeah, where he brings a box of stuff from his dead mum's house or something, and it turns out he has like a Rolex that's worth $100,000 or something. And he's just like, wow, Jesus. But Time Team was always amazing. Is that sort of, I guess, what do I want to ask? What makes British archaeology so interesting? Yeah, start with that.
I don't know. I think it's sort of like in comparison to sort of Australian or American archaeology, maybe, or
the shows always seem to center on that sort of stuff, and maybe I'm biased, and maybe that says something about the TV that I watch, but I wonder how much it's to do with, say, the turnover of cultures that's occurred in Great Britain, which leads us on later on to talk about the language and how English has evolved. But is that part of it too, where we've had so many invasions, so many wars, so many different languages and cultures and people in the same area with this big change turnover?
I think possibly, yeah. Like as you say, like you can be interested in any kind of corner of history, and there's some or European history at least, and there's some aspect of it kind of reflected in British archaeology, I think. Whereas I think if you wanted indigenous archaeology, you'd go, I think, to Australia probably even more so than America, because it's so rich, and obviously there's a continuation of cultures that stretch back tens of thousands of years right up to the present day. Whereas in Britain, you really don't have that kind of thing, because there've been, as you say, this kind of turnover of cultures. So it's a sort of trade-off, I think. But yeah, I think it's just because of the kind of diversity of one culture after another that you only really get a snapshot of the culture.
I always wonder that too with Australian archaeology in particular, because I think if you were to talk to the average Indigenous group, they would say, my group has been in this land forever. Like effectively since time began, based on cultural beliefs. But archaeologically, you would, do research and be able to see that different parts of Australia were populated at different times. It started from the north, I think, went around the coasts and then into the inland and down to Tasmania and everything. The thing that I would love to know more about in terms of, that is just the amount of movement of different groups, because you can imagine that it wasn't just you populate the entire continent and then every single tribe is static. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, they're all hunter-gatherers, right? There is no, we stay in our house on our plot of land and that's it. It's we move around an area of hundreds of square kilometers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Was it sort of the same thing though in Great Britain prior to, say, the invasion of Rome? The invasion by the Romans of Great Britain.
I think the Celtic language speaking people and I say Celtic language speaking people because people get very sort of dodgy about the word Celt as a sort of cultural coverall, but the people that spoke Celtic languages that lived here beforehand were from Europe originally. I think that there have been various turnovers of populations even before writing.
Yeah.
I think in Brittonic speaking, Celtic speaking Britain, there were there were a lot of sort of tribal identities that probably wouldn't have associated with each other very much, and there was sort of it was kind of the easiest modern thing to compare it with, based on sort of Roman ethnographies, would be a kind of warlord, local warlord situation. But of course, that's probably not exactly representative of what it actually was. But before that, it's hard to say what, for example, Paleolithic populations in Britain would have been like, because you have all these kind of marine isotope stages, and Britain being the place that it is, the sea level went up and down, and it was cut off, and then it became accessible. It was cut off and it became accessible. So
it's pretty mind-blowing, right, to think that the first people to get there probably walked there.
Yeah. It's really like the amount of archaeology we've probably lost beneath the English Channel is mental. Like, you still drag up mammoth tusks and things like that from.
We had something like that off the coast of Western Australia recently, where they found their first underwater archaeological site of Indigenous Australians. Because
really?
So the sea level rose, I think it would have been about 14 to 12,000 years ago, which is when Tasmania got cut off from the mainland.
Yeah.
Because people just walked across from the mainland to Tasmania originally. It would have been all really nice grazing land for kangaroos, and they would have just, walked across. But they were doing some underwater archaeological research off the coast, in really shallow water, but ended up finding a bunch of stones that were used for grinding grain and stuff like that, I think. And that was the first underwater site. But just goes to show, Jesus, like how much is hidden under the sand.
Lost, yeah. Like, I think there are indigenous populations along. I always get confused between the south and north coast because I'm so northern hemisphere centric. But the coast furthest from the south, I suppose that's the northern coast, where like populations have stories about specific landmarks that you can still see under the water that must have disappeared something like 10,000 years ago.
You mean Australian Indigenous people, or
yeah. Oh no, not British.
Yeah, that'd be impressive.
Yeah.
Well, there was a really interesting story that it was a TED talk, I think, from an Indigenous woman that was talking about some of the stories that she was told. And I don't know how much you know about Australian Indigenous culture, but there's a story. Well, I think there's a mythical animal creature thing called the bunyip, which is effectively this large creature associated with water that drags off children and men and women into the depths. And obviously, it's very difficult to ever pin down what that story is based upon. But I think the woman was talking about how her tribe's story was that you had this large animal that would come during the night, and in order to escape from it, if you're a child, you have to climb a tree because it can't lift its head upwards. It could only move side to side. Right. And I think that she was suggesting, at least, that research had suggested it could have come from some of the megafauna that was in Australia, such as Diprotodon, which is a large thing that looks like it's a 3-ton wombat crossed with a rhino. And it's just mind-blowing to think that the original Australians to arrive here would have come with a completely different landscape with different animals, these large animals, and they would have had stories that passed on for thousands of years, even after these animals disappeared, that they could explain modern stories that they're still told.
There probably are, given that there's sort of quite verifiable, like the thing about the sea level rising and certain sort of named landmarks living on in oral tradition. I think it's completely possible that like megafauna might have been preserved in mythology. Like, I've heard a few things about. I've even heard some things from the northern US about that kind of thing, like indigenous tribes preserving what might be like mastodons and things like that in their folk memory. I think it's definitely possible. I like the idea of like there being like stories of personal interactions with those kinds of things. Because there was someone, I can't remember who it was. It was probably someone really famous, but they were talking about this time they'd met an old man, an old Australian man who, when he'd been a child, him and his grandfather, or mostly his grandfather, but sometimes he'd been involved, had sort of trapped or accidentally trapped or something thylacines, like Tasmanian tigers, and he sort of described the noises they made. And this bloke who was a zoologist, it was just incredible for him to sort of hear these personal stories of interactions with something that's, as far as it's been extinct for as long as most people alive today have been alive.
Well, that's the craziest thing, though. That would have been one of the last megafauna species to go extinct in living memory. My grandparents would have been born. They would have been born in the 30s, and I think the last
Yeah.
thylacine in zoos in Tasmania died out. It was jail, I guess.
Yeah.
Died out in the 30s, which is tragic. It's crazy when you still see the footage, though, right? The video footage.
Yeah, like it's incredible to see because you only ever see like it's like seeing those what are the fish called coelacanths or whatever they like.
Yeah.
The really archaic fish that they thought were extinct. Like just seeing footage of them swimming around, it's incredible. Like, and I think it kind of not humanizes, but kind of I don't know, almost animalizes animals that are extinct that we're sort of aware of. That it's hard to imagine, for example, for me anyway, it's hard to imagine like a giant ground sloth actually acting like an actual animal because you always see these sort of illustrations of them, but it's hard to imagine it being a real sort of.
Well, the science is getting crazy, right, with that. I mean, I know that when I was studying evolutionary biology, there was a lot of research going on with morphologists, and a lot of them were engineers or physicists who would be able to work out from bone density and the scrapings on bones that would show where the ligaments and muscles were joined and stuff.
Yeah.
They could work out, they could reconstruct all of that based on this relatively full skeleton of an animal, put it through a computer program and tell you this is how it would have moved. And you're just like, what?
Yeah, I love stuff like that, yeah.
And you think about that with Jurassic Park, right? I remember that was a pivotal point in my childhood. I think I would have been, was that 93 when that came out? 93 or 97? I don't know. Was it
came out
in the 90s? But I remember being a young kid watching that and thinking, fuck, like this is what dinosaurs look like. And you see how far they've come since then, realizing that dinosaurs were actually quite often covered in feathers. They didn't actually move this way. They couldn't hold their heads up like that. I think Brontosaurus or whatever it is got renamed, but they showed that those huge dinosaurs, probably the biggest land animals that ever existed, didn't just walk around with their heads up because they would have passed out. The blood would have fallen out of their body because of gravity.
Like they were fairly
Instead, it was horizontal. They could lift it up briefly, but then it would come back down and they would walk around with it horozontally. But I love that science, especially physics and engineering, is coming in and solving problems in biology.
Deduce. There was like a really interesting program on the BBC. I think it was BBC a while ago that was they were trying to recreate the most sort of accurate model of a Neanderthal that had ever been like CGI that had ever been recreated, and they got Andy Serkis who plays Gollum in the Lord of the Rings films to come in and play the Neanderthal and sort of talk it through with them a little bit, and they sort of had animations of the Neanderthals running and stuff with like, I don't know, sort of corrected for that kind of thing, like how fast they would have been able to run and things like that. And it was I don't know how accurate it was, but it was fascinating.
I was just watching that. In fact, I still have it up on my screen here.
That exact thing.
You recently published a video revisiting Neanderthals.
Oh, right. I got massively corrected on like a very obvious thing, which was a bit embarrassing.
I only got 5 minutes through before we started this, but do you want to can you remember much about that video? Do you want to tell us a bit about Neanderthals and why you made that video? I think you were talking about whether or not they're different species, and I'm not sure if you ever get into the languages that they could or may have spoken, etc. But they're pretty.
I've literally just edited a video almost on that exact topic, like the origin of language.
Perfect.
I was going to try and start to do a kind of series talking through the various ideas, and like nobody's come to any concrete conclusions. But I mean, you can't say much about how, like, what actual languages Neanderthals might have spoken. But I think that the sort of what's being debated at the moment is whether they could talk, and I think they probably could on a mechanical level.
I think they've shown that, haven't they?
Yeah,
they had at least the apparatus there in the throat to be able to talk.
Yeah, like they could produce probably the same kinds of speech sounds as we can.
I heard sorry to interrupt you. I heard that they potentially had a high pitched voice.
I've seen that video. I don't know. I've never actually looked into the mechanics of that, but I mean they had quite differently shaped faces and skulls and noses and everything. So I don't know how that would affect it, but I imagine their voices probably would have been different to like modern human voices.
So, what were your findings in terms of, I guess, Neanderthals and language ability? Because it must be something where you imagine that we know humans and Neanderthals, I think, crossed over, lived in the same areas, had
It did,
interactions
yeah.
for something like
That's correct, yeah.
25,000 years. So
Yeah,
you
yeah,
would imagine if they
absolutely.
spoke languages, one group or the other would have a chance to see
Yeah,
that, understand it, learn it, potentially have cultural
yeah, yeah.
exchanges. So, yeah,
I
what did
think
you get out of
there
the
must have
research?
been some. I mean, it's obviously not my research. It's just kind of compiled for the video, but um, it's in terms of actual interactions. There's not really much evidence beyond the fact that we know they interacted. We know they interbred, but you could. I mean, you could at a push say they could have done that without talking to each other. But I think
like,
I think
like
they.
mostly today.
Yeah, yeah. I think they. I suspect they probably just had language the same as we do, like they had complex grammar and stuff. But I mean, you can't really prove something like grammar.
But it
There've
would be
been
very,
attempts by
very surprising, right, for you to find out that
yeah,
language started with modern Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens
absolutely,
sapiens.
yeah,
That would almost be more surprising, you know,
yeah,
especially when we know Neanderthals had tools, they had weapons. So it's sort of like
yeah.
it would make
They
almost
behave very, very similarly to us.
it
Yeah,
would be weirder if they could pass on those things without language, right, than if they were to have language to be able to
yeah,
pass on
yeah,
culture.
absolutely. Yeah, like I agree. Like I think that most of the opposition to the idea they had language comes from people kind of wanting to hold out that there must be something that differentiates us from everything else. But really, there's no. I don't think there's any need to assume that there is something that differentiates us from
Well,
everything else. I
we're
think.
still here, sucked
Well,
in.
yeah. I mean that's enough. Yeah, I really don't. I've not looked into how they might have gone extinct. I mean, there's loads of ideas, but I don't know. I'm not sure. It's
I think
hard
it
because
crosses over. I think there's the idea that humans, Neanderthals had been in, I think, that northern part of Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. I think they left
yeah,
Africa, what, 300,000 years before humans did.
yeah.
Modern humans, sorry, Homo sapiens
Yeah,
did.
that's right.
And there was a great deal of obviously competition between the humans, the Homo sapiens, when they arrived, but also you had a massive amount of climate change occurring at the same time. And
Yeah,
so you
yeah,
could have had any number of things where you have climate changing, the resources that they're trying to get their hands on are, no longer growing there. The animals are disappearing, or they're moving, or they're shifting. Maybe they're even just shifting into land that the Homo sapiens have control of over the Neanderthals.
yeah,
And but apparently it was obviously a really slow grind, because it took 20,000 years or something of interactions until they were
yeah. Like
slowly driven to extinction. It wasn't humans showed
that's
up and then there was a war and they were dead.
yeah, yeah. That's the thing. Like a lot of people will give these like explanations of this contact between the two, and then suddenly all the Neanderthals go into decline. But they were in contact in certain places for at least 15,000 years
Yeah.
before the Neanderthals actually went extinct. And 15,000 years is enough time for the climate to change very drastically. But in the time Neanderthals were in Eurasia, like marine isotope stages go like that. The climate would have changed many, many times from what we'd consider to be a deep ice age to, a time that was slightly hotter than it is now. So
Well, and you wonder
climate
too
change.
if they were a group that, say, relied heavily on food sources like mammoths. You would imagine, and I'm not sure if it's politically correct to say anymore, but the Eskimos or the people that live in very northern parts of Europe that rely heavily upon reindeer as their main source of food. If the reindeer disappear
Yeah,
suddenly, those people could effectively just be wiped out. And so, if you did have Neanderthals relying on one really, really specific element in their culture in order to survive, and that suddenly changes or disappears or is affected, and they
yeah.
can't adapt quickly enough, that could be enough, right?
Well, that's one thing actually that I think a lot of Neanderthal deposits that have been studied, so not actual, well, associated with actual Neanderthal remains, but sort of things that are clearly prey that have, got cut marks and things on them indicating sort of butchery and things like that. They tend to be very heavy with either one or two local species and not much
Yeah.
else. So even if it seems as though they tended to focus on particular species, and not any specific species like all Neanderthals hunted horses or anything like that, but a given in a given area, they seem to have focused on one or two species. So it might have been a case of they got really good at hunting whatever species was most abundant locally, and then if that species went extinct, then maybe they had trouble, you know, altering that system that they had. Because there are suggestions they might have been neophobic because they were in contact with human cultures and they didn't adopt any of our technology or anything like that. But I think I don't know. I'm not sure about that. But
Yeah, you would imagine that you would have time, and surely if you see that this other group has another set of tools, you'd be like, man, that tool seems to be pretty good.
Yeah.
I would love to know, I would kill to know what they thought of one another, because you wonder, if you see one of these images of a Neanderthal, you don't think, oh my God, it's a completely different species of human.
The monster, yeah.
Assuming that that's a good representation of what Neanderthals actually, maybe they were blue, you don't really know about the color that they were, but you would imagine they would have had very similar features. And so if it happened so gradually and you eventually saw, your tribes just managed to get the most far north possible, and then over the ridge is another group of humans that, you don't know is actually 400,000 years separated from you.
Yeah, of course.
Assume they got here first.
Neither group would have known. Yeah.
So do you reckon they would have? Do you reckon it makes sense that they would have potentially learned each other's languages and cultures, or you would expect to see a lot more DNA mixing if that had actually happened, like in somewhere like England, where we've had, successions of invasions and people have stayed, and it's all just become this homogenized, pool of DNA from all these different sources originally.
I think Neanderthals, if let's say they went extinct between sort of 28,000 and 40,000 years ago, I think there were groups still around 28,000 years ago, but we really don't know how common they were at that point. Probably not very common. So that leaves quite a long time of subsequent migrations of modern humans to kind of dilute that DNA.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure, but then I don't know how many of those migrations were from sub-Saharan Africa, which is the one place now I think that there is almost no Neanderthal DNA in native populations. So I'm not sure. I feel like it must have been. It doesn't have to have been very significant interbreeding to give us what we have. So if the average European has something like 2%, maybe slightly less Neanderthal DNA, I think the maximum is around 4%. That's a fair amount, but you don't need much interbreeding to explain that. I think it's more. It depends more on how beneficial the genes were than. And you're the evolutionary biologist, so you could probably say more about this than me. But I expect it probably depends more on how much of an evolutionary advantage the genes kind of.
Or lack of a disadvantage. So they could just be riding. And it depends. I don't know enough about which genes they are, because they could be, or which parts of the DNA sequence, because they could be non-coding genes, which are just sitting there effectively doing nothing as introns. And so it's just stochastic. It's just, they get passed on, and it's random chance genetic drift that's going to allow it to continue or not. And I think you were talking about mitochondrial DNA, and there's no, at least as far as we know,
that's the bit I made a mistake on.
I was wondering, I'm pretty sure, do we have mitochondrial DNA that is from Neanderthals, or we don't? I'm not sure.
I don't think we don't have mitochondrial DNA, but we also don't have Y chromosome DNA. So it really doesn't mean anything. Like I was extrapolating ridiculously. So there's no. That bit is nonsense. I've thought about deleting the video on the basis of that, but I feel like we should keep our mistakes.
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't worry about it too much. It's interesting to just talk about it. And it was interesting that you were talking about whether or not there are different species, because that can be argued so many ways, right? And that was one of the things that was my specialty.
What a species is? Was that
speciation? I was studying the evolutionary biology of native Australian rats. So there were 70 odd species of rats, and it was effectively trying to decide, where does one species start, where does the other end, how old are they? And as you were saying, which you pretty much nailed, it's not just about whether or not something can interbreed or not. And the weird thing is, like, if we want to go deep into this, so you can have different species, quote unquote species, that aren't in contact with one another, like lions and tigers, that can create ligers and tigons, which are sometimes viable animals where they can actually be fertile, I believe. For the most part,
Yeah.
I think the issue may be, at least in their case, the chromosome numbers are different. So when the chromosomes try and match up, for some reason most of them can, but when they're born, they're not able to create gametes to have children.
Right.
So
Okay.
they're non-viable. But you can have these things, you can define it along, can they interbreed? No, they can't. Then they're different species. And then there's do they live in different areas? Yes, they do. Do they look the same? Yes, they do, but they live in different areas, so they're not populations that are connected, so they're different species. Or there's so many different ways of doing it, but it is
Isn't there
interesting.
something about? Sorry.
Or it is interesting to think about it, because there's two sorts of groups when it comes to phylogeny, studying phylogenies. It tends to be people who want to split as many groups as possible into different little groups based on any little details they can find. Like, oh my God, this population has, of birds has a red feather that appears behind the left ear on it. It's a different species, and then there'll be the others that are like, we need to clump as much together as possible. So
the exact same thing with archaeological context. So you find a load of different contexts or a load of different layers that could be different contexts, but there'll be people who say, oh, it's just a load of lenses, just fucking whack it out. And then there'll be people who say, no, it's...
Well, that's the hard thing. So Neanderthals and humans, there would have been a good argument, I imagine, for them to be completely different species when they weren't overlapping in their population distributions. But as soon as they're overlapping and they're able to interbreed, it's kind of like, whoa.
Then you start to go... I mean, it's like with... it might not be like this, but is it like with... is it brown bears and polar bears that historically have had ranges that were completely separate, but now because of climate change they're sort of drifting towards each other and they can...
Yeah, well, that's the thing too. You can have... I think that polar bears are effectively brown bears that it's just a population that ended up in a certain area that selected for rapidly different color fur for them to be able to blend in and hunt effectively. And they probably have a few other characteristics that are, significantly different, as well as their behaviors, the things that they hunt and everything. But they do potentially have an overlap. And I'm not sure if there are hybrids where you'll end up with a polar bear that's sort of like half brown, half white, or it's somewhere in between in terms of its color.
I think there are cases of like the odd wild hybrid where there's been some, like in North America or Canada or something like that, where there's been some dispute over like one species you have to have a certain license to hunt and the other species you can't hunt or something like that.
Yeah.
And there's been a kind of, oh, well, what's the situation here then? I didn't expect, like, it looked like a brown bear, but it was actually like when they got closer, it kind of had a blend of features or something like that. But I don't know too much about it. So.
Well, it's so difficult. And I think you nailed this in your video where you were saying people who sort of argue about this are trying to put things in discrete categories where it's more continuous. You don't necessarily have this is A and this is B. It tends to be that there's a mix between the two, and they can sometimes become discrete populations that are very separated from one another, and then climate changes, something happens, they come back into contact and they mix again. Mm-hmm. And so, which is what happened, say, in Australia with the dingoes. We had, I think they discovered the dingoes got here, I think it was within 5,000 years. And I think now, they thought originally they were from Indonesia or New Guinea, but they've worked out now, I think, that they came from India, because there was a migration of Indians that came to Australia with these dogs, and they found, I think, indigenous DNA is 12 to 20% Indian DNA, because there's obviously been a huge wave. Oh, right, because this that got here and interbred with them and brought the dogs over. But the issue is that since Europeans got to Australia, the dingoes on the mainland, at least, are all hybrids now, quote unquote hybrids, where in other words, they were, for, I think, a few thousand years separated from domestic dogs, but had sort of all become the same color, had the same behaviors, had been isolated. But all of a sudden you bring in a bunch of different dogs, which are effectively the same species as the dingo was anyway, different subspecies, I guess, but now they're all mixed together. And so the weird thing is the government wants to, I think, in different states and territories in Australia, considers them either pests or does consider them native animals. And it depends where you go, because they'll either say they're wild dogs or they're dingoes. And it's kind of like, it's funny because, some places you can hunt them, some other places you can't.
Yeah. That's the thing. I never knew that about dingoes. I always, to my shame, I always thought they were completely native Australian animals. It makes sense though because they're not marsupials. I always thought it
Yeah.
was weird.
Well,
That makes sense actually.
that's one of the interesting things about Australian biology is that the eutherian mammals, that is placental mammals, as opposed to marsupial or monotremes, where monotremes are effectively ones that lay eggs and secrete milk like sweat from their mammary
There are only
glands.
like 2 or 3 species of monotremes about now.
Yeah, the platypus, there's the echidna, and I think there was a much larger echidna that was in Australia, but I think it's gone extinct here, at least as no one's seen it. But you can find it in New Guinea. I think there's records of it a few hundred years ago when people first got here, but then it died out pretty quickly. But it's in New Guinea. But yeah, there's just those 3 that are the sort of archaic, halfway between a mammal and a reptile kind of mammals. And then the marsupials are the ones that they have the pouch and they have very underdeveloped young that effectively are born at the size of a jelly bean, climb outside the vagina, up into the pouch, latch on. But the eutherians only got here, depending on which ones you count, the mainland ones like the rats only arrived 5 million years ago and diversified rapidly into 70 species, just because all these environments were open. Yeah, exactly. And then we had the bats that came over as well, but we had no land mammals that were eutherians. So we didn't have anything like, ungulates or any of those bears or carnivores. They were all marsupials, but we had them in the same niches, right? So like Thylacoleo.
That's the thing. Yeah. Like it must be interesting to kind of see an example of where the niches are all kind of open and a completely different, fundamentally different group of mammals kind of diversifies into those niches, and to see how similarly they kind of, I don't know.
Well, it's just repeated experiments effectively, right? You just you put one version of a mammal, marsupials and monotremes in one place that's isolated like Australia, and you just give them 80 million years and just say have at it. And they end up creating all these forms that are effectively the same thing that you find elsewhere, like these huge herbivores, these smaller carnivores, and then you get rat-like antechinus marsupials that are tiny little dudes. They're all living in the same niches. But anyway, we're meant to be talking about English. How many languages do you speak, and are any of them extant?
Oh,
apart from English.
I speak German if you're not too picky about the grammar. Like I've always been very bad on grammatical gender in German, so I'm always scared to speak it unless I'm drunk, in which case people compliment my pronunciation, but then as soon as it gets into the grammar, they're like picking out mistakes and things, just because I'm very bad at grammatical gender. Because in German, there's
3, right?
Yeah, there's 3 genders, and there's usually no way of predicting from the word what the gender is. Like in Spanish, if it ends with an A, but you just have to kind of know for every word. But it's really just that, and a bit of Old English, although I have to script everything and I have to check everything when I'm doing Old English, because I make a lot of mistakes otherwise.
What got you interested in learning Old English?
I think it was via the dialect route, because I was kind of interested, because I've got grandparents who speak a very conservative is probably not the right word, but a sort of a northwestern English dialect, and then I've got a great uncle who speaks a kind of Devonian West Country dialect, and I just thought it's so interesting how, I wonder what the sort of progenitor of these dialects was, and in fact it's more like different dialects of early modern English were kind of the point of divergence, I think, but Old English is just it's just beyond the realm of understanding for most English speakers. Middle English spoken quickly I wouldn't be able to understand Middle English if it was spoken quickly, but Old English, you can't even read it unless you sort of put the effort in.
Well, you might see what the old pronoun or something and be like, I can kind of see that, but everything else is it's all Dutch or Greek to me.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about the evolution of modern English and the changes that it's gone through in the last 1,500 years?
Yeah, it was through the kinds of example texts you get, like you get Beowulf as an example text for Old English, and then you get something like Chaucer as an example text for Middle English, and it seems like there was a very sudden change, but in reality, in spoken form, it was probably quite gradual. So between Old English and Middle English, you get things like, I think the biggest change there is a lot of the inflection drops off, so kind of unstressed syllables that carry grammatical meaning disappear towards the end of the Old English period. So that's when grammatical gender disappeared.
So that's why conjugation tends to be easier in English today, is it? And yet you go back and you'll learn about he hath and he doeseth and all of those things.
Yeah. Like that's, I mean, that the conjugation aspect kind of preserved in Southern English until the 1600s, which, like, as you say, like the kind of Shakespearean conjugation. But anything like grammatical gender disappeared. And I think a lot of case stuff disappeared towards the end of the Old English period as well, in almost all dialects. I think most of these things kind of started in the north and worked their way south.
Can you give us an example of when you say case? Can you think of something that you would use in Old English?
So like I mean, I can't think of a specific example, but like with the dative case, you'd add certain things to the endings of adjectives when they described a particular noun, and that would also apply to gender. So you'd have a specific ending for a given adjective for the combination of case and gender, and that kind of simplified in that unstressed syllables, which is where these inflections tend to be, got reduced and weakened. So you ended up with all of the vowels just kind of ending up being So that's why in Middle English you have things like ich habe instead of, where in Middle English, where in Old English you'd have ich habe, where the inflection at the end would be so it would have an actual vowel quality, whereas in that's not the best example. So in unstressed syllables at the ends of words, you would have these various different vowels and endings and things. So you might have r at the end of one word and u at the end of another word and at the end of another word, but these just got reduced to in Middle English. So any distinction between case or gender was lost, because that's the only place that a lot of those grammatical distinctions were made, were in the endings of adjectives and verbs and things like that.
Do we know what sort of underlies those changes? Because you imagine that, like with gender, you would think at some point language became much more complex than it began, and you end up with these things like gender and conjugation and different tenses and everything like that. But then quite often they disappear, and you're kind of like, well, what is it? What change happens beneath it at a cultural level that just says, okay, we're going to do this? Or is it just completely random and, it just catches on?
I think with gender, a lot of it is that in English, at least, the thing is, I don't know why gender appeared, because that's, I mean, Proto-Indo-European had gender or something akin to gender. So we can't really go much further back than Proto-Indo-European within the Indo-European language family. I don't know if there are any examples of languages spontaneously producing gender, but I mean, there must be something like that somewhere. But the loss of gender at the stage Old English was at, it really didn't make much ambiguity. So a lot of linguistic change is kind of the balance between avoiding too much ambiguity and making things easy to sort of pronounce, if you see what I mean, making things easy to kind of get the hang of and things like that. So if people start reducing unstressed syllables and reducing, for example, the number of forms of the definite article there are, which is the only two ways you really differentiate gender, then gender disappears, like the distinction between genders disappears, and so it's sort of a moot point what gender a word is, because the concept doesn't really exist without that variation, if you see what I mean. So if all of the endings and all of the definite article forms are leveled, then gender is kind of it doesn't exist as a concept anymore, because if there's no distinction, there's no gender. And I think it's more a phonological thing, because all you really need is, in terms of endings, is phonological changes weakening those endings to the point that there's no distinction between them anymore.
Yeah.
And if that change doesn't produce ambiguity in the language, so for example, if people aren't getting confused because words don't have gender anymore, then it's allowed to happen, and there's nothing stopping it from happening. But sorry.
No. I'm just going to say that it's so interesting that sort of stuff happens, right? And I always find that I speak Portuguese at home with my wife because she's Brazilian, and we're raising our child to speak Portuguese. And it was one of those things when I was learning French and Portuguese and Italian. I was always like, why are there so many why are the genders? Like, it seems like you could just get rid of this tomorrow and the language is going to be just as comprehensible as it is today. I don't understand why this is still here.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you speak to, if you speak to a German or as you say, an Italian or a Spanish person without grammatical gender, they'll still know what you mean. You'll just sound like a foreigner.
Well, so when I was learning Chinese, you learn that they don't have tenses the same way that we do. They tend to have one verb that's the infinitive, and they use it for all different pronouns, and they will say other words or give time or give context to tell you that it was yesterday or tomorrow or the day before yesterday. And you're like, oh, so they could make the argument, why do you have tenses? They're kind of useless. You don't need them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And because you've been raised subjectively in this environment, you're like, well, of course we need tenses. Like, how else do we differentiate between the two?
How else would we? Like, I think it's one of those trade-off things. Like, there are languages which have not very many quite long words, and the words, have inflections which store that kind of grammatical meaning. And then you have languages that have more words, but the words are shorter, and you tend to store that grammatical meaning in lots of collections of words rather than inflecting a given verb or a given adjective to have particular grammatical connotations. I don't know much about Mandarin. Was it Mandarin?
Yeah, well, and the interesting thing with Mandarin, obviously there are a lot of Asian languages that are similar with the tones add a significant amount of meaning, whereas in English, and again, this is anecdotal, but I think the only stuff that we kind of use in English with tones, aside from intonation, when overall a sentence you're using it, on single words would be when you're saying things like like you're doing this dun dun, or like you're going dun dun. So we do have tones, but it tends to be not really specific words, but more those sort of like that sort of stuff like where we use it.
They're not phonemic, like they don't. Yeah, they're not like phonemic within the language. They're only used in kind of isolated cases.
Yeah, exactly. So it blows my mind with those sorts of languages where they couldn't be more different from English. And the thing with Mandarin that looked from the outside so fucking hard to try and wrap your head around is effectively having to lose this kind of intonation when speaking and not being able to
confuses.
Changes the meaning. So you would say something like 再见, and you're going dun, dun, and it's going up, and it's meant to be goodbye. But from memory, I believe it's 再见, like it's meant to be going down, and you're saying goodbye. And so you can't really do it in a surprised, happy kind of manner, the same way that you would in English, like "see you guys." And so it has this completely different quality to the way in which you speak, and that's why I think Asian speakers from languages like Cantonese and Mandarin and Vietnamese and Thai have a lot of trouble with getting the intonation in English, because we don't have it necessarily on specific words unless we're emphasizing something, and we use it for questions and stuff like that, where they will have words that they just insert at the end of a sentence to show it's a question. And you'll be like, it's two different ways of solving the same problem. Like that's like what you said about them struggling to sort of find the intonation patterns of English. That's interesting, because I think it's something even I didn't really think about until earlier this year. I sort of met with one of the linguistics lecturers at my university, and we had a bit of a talk about intonation, and I didn't realize, like, one of my flatmates has almost, or not flatmate anymore, but one of my flatmates for the last few years has almost the same accent as me, a sort of Southern English accent. Yeah.
But sometimes I just can't understand her when she talks. And I realized the reason for that was that her family is Irish and she speaks with Irish intonation. So it's just me getting confused because I don't expect that intonation with that accent.
Yeah.
And that was what was causing the difference. And it would have never occurred to me that intonation makes that much of a difference to our understanding, but it really does.
Well, even with tag questions in English, if someone asks me a question with a descending tone and they don't put a tag question on the end, I'll think it's a statement, and they'll look at me like it's a question, and that's when I'm like, well, what? Like, so if they say you're going out, you're going out. And I'll be like,
Oh, rather
is that an
than
order?
going
What?
out.
And they'll be like, no, I mean, are you going out? And you're like, well, you have to either invert it or put a, you're going out, aren't
Yeah,
you?
you've got
Like,
to, yeah.
but anyway,
Is that like foreign? Is that like second language English speakers, or is it
yeah,
like
yeah,
just
exactly. Second language English speakers, and that's the sort of stuff that's really advanced when you start getting used to the intonation and those subtle things, you know, like sarcasm, you know, like the difference between oh, good on ya and yeah, good on ya, you know, that sort of
Yeah,
stuff. You don't
yeah,
even realize with that intonation, there's a lot that's behind the words themselves in terms of, you know, rhythm or intonation. This other messaging that's coming across, right, that you may not
absolutely.
get.
Yeah,
And I'll
like
have that with Portuguese, where else I'll be speaking to someone and Kel will be like, he was actually really angry. And I'll be like, what? I thought we were
right,
getting
yeah,
along well.
yeah. Does it differ much from language to language then? Like how intonation? I mean, I suppose if it differs from dialect to dialect, then it must differ from language to language. Like that was.
From my limited experience, the intonation definitely does. Like in Portuguese, I notice myself using intonation differently. Like it goes up and down a lot more. Like if I was saying something like, o que você vai fazer mais tarde? Like they do this dun, 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 sort of at the end of the sentences.
Yeah,
Like that was, what are you doing later? And we would, in English, you'd say, what are you doing later? Or what are you doing later? And they would, yeah,
yeah,
they would say something that's sort of similar depending on it, but they have this really different rhythm to it and a different intonation. In French, it's kind of flat, really flat.
yeah.
Like, qu'est-ce que
I
tu fais
noticed
plus
that. Yeah,
tard? You would say, you know, it's just all flat. There's no dun, 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 dun.
yeah, yeah.
So it is interesting when you start getting the hang of those things and you realize just how much you're sort of painting pictures with a limited set of colors when you speak one language, and all of a sudden you're
Yeah,
like, oh my god, there's all these other colors and everything.
yeah.
But
Like you never notice things about your own language.
yeah, exactly. What have you learned from learning Old English? Because that must be like holding up a crazy mirror, right?
It's a bit strange in terms of like going into it. You always, or at least I kind of expected it to resemble modern Germanic languages, but like most modern Germanic languages have lost, like the case and like a lot of modern Germanic languages have lost certain genders. So, for example, I think Frisian only has common and neuter; it doesn't have all three genders anymore.
And for those listening, Frisian is where the Anglo-Saxons who came over into the UK, who brought Old English, were speaking an Anglo-Frisian dialect, right?
They were, but like modern Frisian, I think there are three Frisian languages that are still spoken on the continent. The most common is that, or rather, the most widely spread is West Frisian, and that's like spoken in like a certain corner of the Netherlands, and they're theoretically the most similar languages to English, but there's really no resources to like learn them apart from resources in Dutch. So it's very hard to.
So weird because you'll listen to someone and you're like, this person doesn't have an accent, but they're speaking a different language. So they're using, it sounds like they're really using all the phonemes of English, all of the sounds of English,
absolutely.
but they've reordered things. And you'll get this sort of like, I understood he just said, what is my name or something. Like there's basic sentences they'll say and you'll be like, oh, I understand all of that. And then it just goes back out. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really peculiar. Like if it's one of those languages where if you kind of listen to it through a wall, you think it's someone speaking English, but sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So they came over. The Anglo-Saxons came over in about 500 AD, right? And brought that dialect with it. So, but how was it different? You know, how when you were learning it, was it just really shocking to learn just how different it was, or was it very similar to what you speak currently as modern English than you were thinking?
I think it was more different than I expected, because in like something like those videos where I dress up in a sheet and speak Old English, like it's very tempting. And I think in the first one I did go for the whole pronouncing unstressed syllables as just like I was mentioning earlier, but they clearly, the way they're written, at least in sort of ecclesiastical texts and things like that, they clearly have separate vowel values in Old English. Whereas in most Germanic languages, they're just reduced to a central vowel nowadays. In Old English, and I think in Old Dutch and Old High German as well, they had like full, fairly, what's the word? Peripheral vowel values. So, which is, it's weird for a speaker of a Germanic language, because it's not something you expect. Like it doesn't really, on the one hand, it kind of sounds like Dutch when you speak it with reconstructed pronunciation, like late West Saxon pronunciation, but on the other hand, there are aspects of it that you feel like you're being too stringent with pronunciation of weak syllables in particular, when really you're just doing what the texts are telling you to do. They spell certain vowels consistently with different letters, therefore they must have had different qualities to the people
Yeah.
that were writing this text.
So is that part of the frustrating thing too? Because I was my next question was going to be, how do you know how an extinct language was pronounced?
Yeah, it is a frustrating thing, because there are certain aspects of it that you just can't know. For example, like aspiration, like in English,
Mm-hmm.
in certain positions in a word, you'll pronounce "p" with a sort of burst of air, but in
Yeah.
certain parts, you pronounce it almost like a "b" sound. So, like the difference between pin and spin. In
Yes.
spin, it sounds more like a "b," but you can't know how that was done in Old English, because I think most European languages nowadays pronounce all of their voiceless plosives unaspirated,
Well, you
which
don't
is
write it
a bit
either, right? So it gets very difficult with, say, Indian people trying to learn, who
absolutely, yeah,
speak Hindi, trying to learn English, because I don't think they have aspirated consonants, and they don't know when, because it's not in the
yeah,
spelling
because
itself, right?
no, absolutely, yeah, like
Is
because it's an allophonic feature rather than a phonemic feature. So people that speak the language it doesn't occur to them that they're two different sounds, because
yes.
it's an allophonic feature. So you don't write it down, because as far as you're concerned, it's obvious it's just the same sound. But
And when you say allophonic, you mean that there's variation on the sounds, but you don't actually know of them or hear them or notice them, right? Like
yeah,
you could,
yeah,
for instance, I think a good example of that is where in Australian English you would say something like the location here. You could say a long vowel here, but you'll also hear people say here, and they'll
yeah,
widen the
yeah,
mouth,
yeah,
and that's an allophone, because it's not, the written is exactly the same, but it
yeah,
varies. And I'll even say both sometimes, like, I'll say, yeah, here, and then other times I'll be like, here, like, you do it, and
yeah,
it's so funny how that you'll have different pronunciations at different times.
yeah, yeah. Like
But
people, if someone pointed it out to you, you'd probably take a minute to realize what they meant, even though you've actually pronounced it differently from a sort of acoustic and a mechanical point of view. To you, it's
yeah,
just the same. It's the same word with the same sound. Yeah.
so much is going on differently. I interviewed a linguist recently, and she was saying you change that depending on who you're talking to. If I talk to children
Yeah.
versus adults
Totally.
versus foreign English speakers versus academics or famous people, humans actually speak multiple dialects of the same language, their native language, where they'll switch
Yeah.
in and out. Code switching occurs
Yeah.
effectively.
Absolutely.
So, like, I'll stop
Yeah.
swearing if I'm in front of someone very important.
Yeah. Like I'll sometimes fail to do that, but yeah, no, it's really interesting to view it as kind of like, because I think a lot of the problems people have with, I mean, it's almost like the semantic difference between two species. It's like the semantic difference between what's a dialect and what are two separate dialects and what are two separate languages. A lot of it really comes down to the fact that if you're looking at it kind of objectively, every person has their own way of speaking, and when a baby learns to talk, it learns anew how to talk, and each person not only has their own way of speaking, but has, as you say, multiple ways of speaking.
Yeah.
So really, all that a dialect is lots and lots and lots and lots of individual idiolects that happen to be very, very similar to each other. And I think that's the best way of looking at it. Lots and lots of individual units that happen to be very similar and happen to be compatible with each other, almost identical to each other, but they're still individual units, and people have their own weird their own weird sort of idiosyncrasies and things like that.
It's kind of like athleticism, any kind of sport. I was doing jiu-jitsu for a long time when I was living in Melbourne, and you would find that people would learn the basic same techniques, but they would end up doing them in different ways quite often,
Really?
because their bodies are different. Yeah, so you would have to be able to, throw people or choke people or do things, and quite often someone would, whether or not they realize, their bodies, like, they got longer arms, so they can do the same technique, but they use different movements that I couldn't do because my body's different. Yeah. But I see what he's doing, and it's exactly the same thing, quote unquote, as I do.